All right, this is part 2 of the open drive conversion. The last part 1, I put the transmission in with no adapter, just using some factory parts, some Jeep parts, modifying them slightly right onto the bell housing there. Now for the second part of this, I'm going to show you what I did for the rear end. This is a 1995 S10 rear end, a 4-wheel drive, of course, so it's got the right width. This has a 342 gear ratio. I decided to go with the 342 instead of the 373s because I have the early model 5-speed with the 0.86 overdrive, and so not a real high overdrive on it. But so I'm hoping this 342 is going to work out good with the stock size tires. Now what I did is, because you know that when you swap the rear ends for a Tri-5 rear end or whatever, you got to drill the spring pads forward 1.5 inches and in 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. Well, what I did on this one is I got on some forums and found out if you take the leaf spring and flip it around, then it centers it up in the wheel well without having to drill the spring pad. So that's what I did on this one. I took my leaf spring and I flipped it around, and I got on Chevs of the 40s and got some new bushings for the leaf springs. The ones with the steel around the outside for the end that normally goes in the frame end. So I put those in, flip the leaf spring around, and as you can see, this axle is lined up in the fender well. Let's see, I'll throw this on here just for looks. There you have it, stock spring, center hole pad, flipped it around. It's right in the wheel well. I put on some new shackles. Okay, what I did for pads, I just got some like 1 3/4 the trailer leaf spring pads and welded those on to the S10 rear axle. Took the measurements from, the center on the factory width, and then looked up the measurements for the S10 width as far as spring distance. That way I could find out the distance here of where to come off of the spring pad to weld them in the center of the rear axle. Let me get that measurement for you. All right, what I did, this distance between these two pads is about 7/8 of an inch, and I just left the other one on there for now. Maybe I'll grind that off or use it for a mount or something later on, but it wasn't in the way, so I just left it. So I went ahead and welded that spring pad on 7/8 of an inch away from the other one, and the same thing on the other side. Same thing on the other side. And this side's together. I got the e-brake to hook up. I temporarily rednecked up a shock mount here. Just took that factory shock mount, clamped it to the spring. No e-brake as of current. That's still got to be hooked up. But as far as having this thing bolted in, I mean, it's bolted in. Now it's just the little stuff. So on to the other side. Now, as far as getting these bushings out, I mean, they're in there good, especially 60 plus years old. What I found out is an air hammer can be your best friend. Just keep working it and hammering this out, and it will eventually push that whole bushing out. It's the best way I found to get it out, besides burning that bushing and then having to grind that outer sleeve out. There you have it. One bushing beat out with the air hammer. It's about the quickest and best way I know how to do it. Just kind of work that hammer around, and this thing will just walk right on out of there. Now time to take the new one and press it in. Here's that bushing kit from Chevs of the 40s. I think it was $35 shipped to my door for the 2 bushings with bolts and nuts. A little something when I was pressing those bushings in that spring is if you get a couple sockets, I got 1.25 inch here and 24 millimeter or equivalent. That 24 fits on the top real good of that bushing, and the 1.25 inch is big enough to set on the spring but allow it to push down in there. Because if you notice on that leaf spring, that bushing comes out 1/8 of an inch or so on either side of the spring. It's wider than the actual spring. So these make it real nice so you can actually push that bushing all the way through. Okay, one thing I had to do is I bought these shackles just as an OEM replacement shackle off of Rock Auto or Amazon or whatever for pretty cheap, like 10 bucks, 12 bucks. And they come with the bolts pressed in. Well, flipping the springs around, as you can see, that bushing sticks outside of the spring now. So the bolt's not really long enough to make it all the way across. So I went and ground the top of those bolts off, knocked them out of the one side of the shackle, and got some 7/16 by 3.5 inch bolts, and that works out really good. In hindsight, I probably should have just bought, like, trailer shackles or whatever with the bolts, and I would have been just fine. But this way works too. But just know, if you do get that OEM setup, that those bolts are not going to be long enough if you swap these springs around, you flip them around to get the axle centered. Okay, I got this side all on just like the other side. Bolts in the front. Same thing, shackles all pulled way up there when you got it hanging. But boy, that leaf spring's a real bugger to get on. Same thing of, bolt it to the axle, and then I just kind of use the axle and a pry bar to pull the whole thing forward, and got it bolted in and that much closer. So the rear end's in, bolted up to the springs, went ahead and hooked up the brake line. Turns out the factory brake line goes right into the 95 S10 junction block. I'll double check it here in a while or in the morning and see if it's leaking at all, but it seemed to fit in there pretty good. I went to put the drive shaft in and realized I didn't have the right drive shaft. So I'll get to that the next step. But anyway, there it is. I got the transmission in, got the rear end in, got the leaf springs hooked up to it just with the trailer U-bolts and pads. Got the brake lines hooked up, got the shocks hooked up to the springs, little redneck ingenuity. But next is the drive shaft, and figure out if I'm even going to do an e-brake on this or not. But heck, why not? It's a single reservoir master cylinder with no e-brake. What could go wrong, right? Anyway, that much closer to getting this thing back on the road and at least driving for a bit, and then I can keep working on it as I go.